don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with investigative reporter Chris Papst. Chris is the author of a book based on his investigative reporting titled Failure Factory: How Baltimore City Public Schools Deprive Taxpayers and Students of a Future. His reporting explores how Baltimore City Schools is one of the most well-funded large school systems in America, yet simultaneously is one of the lowest performing. Before I get to some of the details, I'd like to remind you to visit our website, wegrowteachers.com, to learn more about our professional learning workshops and services. All of our work, including project-based learning, differentiated instruction, civics education, AI and education, and other instructional practices and mindsets, is focused through what we call knowledge-rich inquiry. We work with schools around the world online and on site, and if you're interested in PBL, we are in the early bird registration pricing phase for our summer PBL conference, PBL Grow 26, through the end of February. Once again, the website is wegrowteachers.com, and we are celebrating our 10-year anniversary. And you can find our blog posts and this podcast there as well. And as always, feel free to email me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org if you have questions, comments, or concerns. During our conversation, Chris shares some truly egregious examples of the systemic failure, and he focused on policies designed to prioritize passing students, which often resulted in changing grades to make that happen. This includes a student who missed 120 out of 180 school days, but still walked across the graduation stage, and accounts from teachers who describe diplomas being issued to students who are functionally illiterate. He argues that this system is driven by a focus on keeping enrollment numbers up for school funding, and while I think we should all be hesitant to castigate teachers and school leaders, especially ones working in our most challenging schools, the evidence that we have some very serious problems in public education and minimizing or failing to reckon with them is tantamount to educational malpractice in my view. And now here's my conversation with Chris. I am with Chris Papst, and he is an investigative reporter in Baltimore. He's going to introduce himself in just a moment. We're going to talk about his book called Failure Factory: How Baltimore City Public Schools Deprive Taxpayers and Students of a Future. Chris, welcome to the podcast. Want to say or give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and tell us who you are before we get into the meat of the book.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me on. Yeah, so my name's Chris Papst. I work for Fox 45 in Baltimore, a company that is owned by our parent company, Sinclair Broadcast Group. And I work for a project called Project Baltimore. And what we are is that we are a team of 5. There's 2 photographer editors, 2 producers, and myself as the reporter. And in January of 2017, 9 years ago, we launched. And when we launched, we decided that we were going to focus on one issue. And that's really what we are, is a team of 5 that really focuses and devotes our professional lives to one issue. And the issue that we picked was public education, specifically in Baltimore City. And the reason that we picked that was because back in 2017, we could see that Baltimore City Schools, according to federal data, was one of the most funded large school systems in America. And we could also see, according to federal data, that Baltimore City was one of the lowest performing large school systems in America. And that was really the question that Project Baltimore came up with 9 years ago that resulted in the book Failure Factory, was asking, how can this be allowed to happen? And why is this happening? Why do you have one of the most funded large school systems in America, but yet one of the lowest performing? And Drew, I wrote the book because what I see happening in Baltimore after these 8 or 9 years is certainly happening throughout the entire country. So I wrote Failure Factory as largely a warning to the rest of the country, saying that you really should focus on what's happening in our public school system, because it's very expensive. And if it doesn't go well, it has dire outcomes.
Yeah, and it's a pretty damning book with lots of dynamics. Anybody who's worked in public schools, especially larger city public schools, and we're based in Louisville. I used to work in Louisville, Jefferson County, and they're cutting budgets and got all kinds of some similar issues, certainly, and hopefully not the same kinds of issues, or at least to the extent that you've detailed in this book. But big city schools are not known for their, let's say, efficiency and perhaps strong leadership. So, yeah, you've given us a little bit of a sort of an elevator pitch on the book. Is there anything more to say about, just sort of like if somebody says, so what's your book about? Is there anything more to sort of add to the elevator pitch you just gave us?
Baltimore is a struggling city. If you've ever been to Baltimore, it is struggling in every sense of the word. It used to have close to 1 million people. Now it's down to 550,000. If it keeps going the way it's going, in a few years, it'll drop below 500,000. Every year, it's one of the most dangerous, murderous, crime-ridden cities, not just in America, but in the Western Hemisphere. 20 to 25% of the people in the city live in poverty. There's 15,000 blighted structures. It's a really tough place. And I make the argument in the book that Baltimore is really at the end stages of what a failing public education system can do to a community and can do to a society. And Drew, that's really why I wrote Failure Factory, because Baltimore is the example of decade after decade of undereducating a society, and what really does to the local community. It's heartbreaking. These kids, city, they simply don't have the math and the reading skills that they need to properly take care of themselves and their families. They just don't. The data is supporting that. The data is showing that. And then you see the result of that in how Baltimore is really a shrinking city that's struggling to survive. That is how important, Drew, I think this issue is. And after doing this every day of my professional life for 8 years and writing this book, I'm here talking to you right now because I'm trying to get the word out, and I'm trying to let people know what is really happening in many of our public schools.
Yeah, so we have, if anybody's been paying attention, have seen some similar stories, and certainly NAEP scores have gone down, COVID being a big piece of that. But this is something more, right? Like you detail grade changing, grade inflation, which again is, I see lots of complaints about this kind of thing in social media, but it's not the same kind of thing. Like what they're tending to talk about is, kids getting A's when they should have maybe gotten a B or something like that. But you're talking in the book about policies where kids who literally did not go to class, maybe you'll know better than I, just a few days out of the school year, and can't read, can't write, don't know anything about what that course might be about, and they're passing. And there's some very odd dynamics of how many times they can fail a student. Some of those things. So maybe what are some of the sort of most, egregious examples that you have in the book, or things that you think are sort of most salient there?
We interviewed a student who, in his senior year, he missed 120 days of school. There's 180 days in a school year. He missed 120, but yet he walked across the stage on graduation day. We interview teachers who say they have given students diplomas that the students can't even read. Illiterate kids that are getting diplomas. We talk to families where we talked to one mother, Sierra Ford. Her son in 3rd grade failed every class except one. She went to the school. She said, please hold my child back in 3rd grade so he can master this material before moving to 4th grade. And the school system moved him to 4th grade. And why would they do that? Well, in the book, we talk to teachers who say that public education is focused on passing students, not educating students. The focus is passing, not learning. And why is that? It's because schools are funded based on enrollment. And a school's goal is to keep a child enrolled as long as possible, because that is how they get more funding. And when we started Project Baltimore in 2017, I remember people that were saying to me, Drew, that they were like, listen, if you're really going to devote your life to this, your professional life to trying to figure out what's happening in public education, what you're going to find is that the school systems no longer prioritize educating kids. They prioritize the acquisition of funding, and then they use that funding to hire adults, which grows the power and political influence of public education. And at the time, in 2017, I didn't want to believe it. Like, my dad was a public school teacher for 35 years in Pennsylvania in the teachers union. I went to public schools K through 12. My brother did as well. So to hear somebody tell me that the public education system is no longer focused on educating kids, it's focused on money, I didn't want to believe it. But I wrote Failure Factory because, after doing this for 8 years, I now believe that it's true. But I believe it's true for the reasons that I lay out in the book, which are the data is strongly suggesting or showing or even proving that that is the case. And we can kind of dissect that data as we move forward. But you talked about policies. And one of the things that I do in the book is that I lay out policies that readers can look for in their own school systems that are indicative of the school system's academics are falling and they're trying to pass more kids without educating them. And one of these policies that seems very mundane, but is extremely important, is called the 50% rule. And what the 50% rule says, and Baltimore City has this, is that a student cannot receive below a 50 for a semester or marking period grade, no matter what. So this student can never show up. They can miss 45 days of school. They can never take a test, never do homework, never turn in any homework assignment, never take a quiz. And they will get a 50%. That's where they start, as opposed to a 0. And why would the school system do that? Well, they do it because they want more kids to pass. But you would think to yourself, well, if you want more kids to pass, perhaps you should focus on educating them better. But that is not what the public schools tend to do. The focus is not to better educate the kids. The focus is to come up with policies like the 50% rule to simply pass the kids easier so them move on to the next grade and matriculate. And in Failure Factory, I lay out a number of policies like that, where if you see this policy in your school system, no matter where you are in the country, it's indicative that you're struggling. And I'll just make one more point here. In Baltimore, so Baltimore City has the 50% rule. The surrounding school systems do not, except one. Baltimore County Public Schools also has the 50% rule, but they didn't adopt it until like 2015. And if you go back, Drew, and you look at student performance metrics in Baltimore City, you will see that they're starting to collapse. And in 2015, the school system passes this 50% rule, and it makes it look like there's more kids passing now, which there are, but those kids are passing, they're not learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you've brought up the issue of these policies, and the reasonable expectation would be if they're not passing, then just educate them better and do a better job of helping them pass. But therein, there's a question to be begged there, and as I was reading the book, it struck me that it's just not a new or unique sort of takeaway, but there's so many things involved here, right? There's sort of a circular downward spiral of factors of poverty and socioeconomics and parents' education and unions and all of these kinds of things that you can imagine. And having worked in schools, and again, having worked in a big city school and worked with schools in our professional development, where we certainly have seen some of those dynamics, you can sympathize with the adults who are either subject to and or making and carrying out these policies, right? So one of the things that I highlighted here, a quote that you were talking with somebody and interviewing, and the quote was, "The principal did what she had to do," he concluded, right? And so it's easy to sort of cast blame and find villains, and I think there are some villains here. And to the extent that you want to identify those villains and talk about them, naming them or anything like that, feel free to. But it is such a really it's such a frustrating situation, because no one entity can seem to make enough change to move it forward in the way that one would hope you would move it forward, right?
Well, that quote that you mentioned, the principal did what she had to do, that came from the president of Pizzazza. And Pizzazza is the principals union of Baltimore City Public Schools. And that quote was given to me because we had a text from a principal at a school called Calverton Elementary Middle in Baltimore City. And the text was informing all the teachers in the school to change failing grades to passing. And it was that direct. The principal says in this text, which was leaked to me that we reported on, all grades below a 60, please correct to a 60, 60 being a D-, which is the minimum passing grade. So we did that story, and I lay out all the details in the book about how we got the text, and I even interviewed a teacher from that school who received the text. And when we did that story, Baltimore City Schools did an investigation. And Baltimore City Schools' own investigation concluded that that principal acted improperly and improperly directed her teachers to change failing grades to passing. However, the principal kept her job. So the question that we often have is, isn't that fraud? So if a teacher analyzes a student's performance and says this student gets a 55, and somebody else goes into that teacher's gradebook, changes the teacher's grade so that student matriculates to the next grade. This is a government document. A report card is a government document. A transcript is a public document. Graduating from high school, like that's a state issued piece of paper there. And if grades are being changed, how is that not fraud? If Baltimore City Schools is saying that this principal improperly changed grades, therefore putting kids in situations that they weren't prepared for and did not earn, how is that not fraud? So I go to the head of the principals union, and that's what he said to me, Drew, as you just wrote. He goes, the principal did what the principal had to do. But when I pressed him on it, and I'm like, what does that mean? What do you mean the principal did what the principal had to do? The principal had to go in and change failing grades to passing to move kids to 5th grade when those kids didn't deserve to be there. And that's the part, Drew, that we don't get the answer to. What does that mean? And we can theorize. I could come up with 5 different things that means, but I'm not exactly sure what it does mean. All I know is that we have a principal that told her teachers to change failing grades to passing, regardless of the student doing extra work or earning it. The teachers found to have violated those policies within the school system, but yet the teacher keeps the principal keeps the 6-figure job that the principal had. No, it's those types of things that I think really drive people crazy, because this is the future of students at stake here. And these students are now put in a situation that they're not prepared for. If you did not pass 4th grade and you don't understand the material in 4th grade, you're just going to fall farther behind in 5th grade. And that's what we're seeing happen throughout all of Baltimore City and in many parts of the country.
Yeah, and again, I have some sympathy for some of the actors here, right? Because again, you're sort of trapped in a failing system, and you're trying to one, certainly you don't want to lose your job. You're trying to do maybe what you can within the constraints of the rules and the laws and the maybe not the laws, the policies, to try to help kids. And there's sort of decisions that might have you might have two options and neither of them are good. You talk about trying to get in touch and have interviews with administrators from principals on up, and how evasive they were. And the picture of the redacted files, which I don't know how many pieces of paper, you may know exactly how many pieces of paper it was, but it was a lot, and a lot of black covering, almost no text. So kind of unpack that sort of obstruction that you faced in trying to get this story out.
Well, the school systems want the money, but they don't want anybody asking questions about the money. So in Baltimore City Schools, they get about 1.7 this year. They're going to get 1.7, $1.8 billion to educate roughly 75,000 kids. So they're getting about $23,000 per kid. And they just want to be left alone. They don't want somebody asking them questions about how the money is being spent. So let's go back to 2017. And this is the root answer of your question, is when Project Baltimore launched, one of the first big stories that we broke was we found, after analyzing state test scores, that there were 6 Baltimore City schools that did not have any students proficient in anything, English or math. No state test did any kid score proficient in 6 entire schools. So we figure that out by looking at the state data. We publish it, story goes viral. And we had teachers reach out to us. And those teachers were saying, you realize that many of these kids are still graduating. And I started conversations with them. And I'm like, how are these kids graduating? And like, well, our grades are being changed. The school's going into our grade book, changing the grades to graduate these kids. So I filed a public records request with Baltimore City Public Schools to obtain emails and documents and internal investigations pursuant to grade changing. And the school system wrote me back and said, we're not going to give you anything. So we sued them. Fox 45, Sinclair Broadcasting, we sued Baltimore City Public Schools, and we won. And the judge ruled, a Baltimore City Circuit Court judge ruled that, I testified for 2 hours that day. It was a big deal, that Baltimore City Schools willfully and knowingly violated the law, by not handing over the documents. And the judge said that you knew what you were doing was illegal, but you did it anyway. And in the judge's words, she said, I believe you did it to hide possible wrongdoing. And then when we got all the documents and we started airing them and going through the emails, we were able to show that grade changing was a systemic problem throughout all of Baltimore City Public Schools, that grades were being changed on a mass scale from failing to passing to matriculate kids and to eventually get them diplomas, to the point where the Inspector General for Education did a report and found in a 4-year period that there were 12,542 grades that were improperly changed. 12,542. And he said upwards of 10% of kids were graduating who should not have. I mean, in my view, that's fraud. I mean, a degree, a diploma from a state has to be certified by people within the school system. And if the Inspector General is coming out saying that, these kids did not earn it, that's fraud. But yet nobody was held accountable. Nobody was charged with a crime. It's just allowed to happen. And a lot of Failure Factory is telling that story in detail. It took us 5 years. I mean, you read the book. It took 5 years for us to go through that entire investigation, because the school system fought us the entire time because they didn't want to turn over the documents, because they knew what they were doing and they didn't want the public to know.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a book called No Adult Left Behind, and that's authored by Vladimir Kogan, who was on the podcast sometime last year. And his assertion, while it's not necessarily about fraud, and there were some examples that he was referring to there in that book, but essentially is that a lot of our public schools are operating as the number one. The adults are who is being most served, and that the students are being sort of placed at the end of the line, which of course is a bit maddening, or more than a bit maddening. In this case, you're talking about grade changing. That's not, again, we're not talking about, somebody given a little bit of extra credit or something like that. We're talking about a large number of students who are essentially incompetent as students. They just have not been educated. They can't and should not be matriculating, but they're moving on. And so again, the focus being on the adults, and like some of the things that you detailed, like one of the things that I noticed is $30,000 in Wizards tickets. I assume Washington Wizards tickets, and kind of unpack that a little bit. Some of those, I guess, gory details of, like, we're not just talking about grades. We're talking about much more than just grades.
Oh, of course. So what you're talking about there was one of the internal investigations from Baltimore City Schools that we acquired through suing them and winning, is what you just talked about right there. When we filed the original public records request that they denied, We wanted to know what their internal investigations were. And at the time, Drew, they told us that there were 12 internal investigations the school system had done into grade changing. And after we won in court and the judge really laid a smackdown on the school system, it actually ended up being, I think, 22 or 24. So all of a sudden they found a bunch more that they're like, well, these didn't exist until they lost in court. And one of them was what you're talking about. There was a principal who was using school funds to buy really expensive furniture for her office, to buy, what was it, Apple TVs. She spent $30,000 on Washington Wizards basketball tickets. She was using them for her own personal, use. And, Baltimore City Schools, like this is one of the things they were trying to cover up. And in the book, there's a lot of things that they were covering up that we were able to expose simply because, we stayed devoted to it and we stayed focused on the topic because, we could see that all these things nothing really made sense, Drew, when you look at the school system. They get in 2024, which is the last year for which we had data, because educational data tends to lag a year, and the new data is not out yet for 25. But in 2024, and that's the year that the book covers, 2016 to 2024, those 8 school years. The Baltimore City had a 70% graduation rate. That same year, 10% of the kids tested proficient in math in the school system. So how do you have a 70% graduation rate, but yet 10% of your kids are proficient in math? And it kind of all goes back to what we were talking about and what we have been talking about, which is the emphasis is on passing, not learning. The focus is not to educate kids. The focus is to acquire the funding and then use that funding to hire adults to grow the power and influence of the school system, which then in turn delivers more funding. And when you look at data like that, 70% graduation rate, 10% of kids are proficient in math, and you're like, this is why we were staying on this hard and for so long, and we're still doing it today, is because none of it makes any sense. That anybody listening right now is going to scratch their head and go, "That what?" But it's real. And when we started getting the internal investigations and we started getting all the documents from the lawsuit, we could see why it was real. And it was real because of the grade changing, taking failing grades and simply changing them to passing. And because of what you pointed out, where principals are taking $30,000 in school funds that could be used for tutoring, for example, and they're buying themselves Washington Wizard basketball tickets. Those are some of the things that are happening in public schools.
Yeah. So again, coming back to the unions and the role of unions, and not the only sort of bad actor here, but you write about some involvement and some, I have some mixed feelings about unions, but I've seen, some ways in which they have, I think, not necessarily been acting in the best interest of students. That's a whole other podcast. But one of the lines that struck me was you were talking with somebody, and you have here the quote, when being a teacher went from a profession to a job, he lowered his head. That is when everything changed. And that begs the question to me when we think about the ways. I mean, I was a teacher. My daughter is in school to become a teacher. My mom was a teacher. My grandmother was a teacher. I view it as a profession, and certainly think we should. But what does that mean? What's your sort of takeaway from that quote and that line? And what was your experience in terms of working with teachers and, other leadership and administration who perhaps might think of it more as a profession than that job?
Well, it should absolutely be considered a profession. And as I said, my dad was a teacher for 35 years. So I grew up, in that mentality. And that quote that you're mentioning comes from a man named Dr. Alvin Hathaway. He's also a pastor in Baltimore City, and he runs a pre-K, the most successful pre-K in Baltimore City. And the reason that we were doing that story is because we had noticed that early childhood development in Baltimore City is actually very good. Kids are entering kindergarten, according to state data, with all the skills necessary to be successful. But by third grade, once they enter Baltimore City Public Schools, all of that is lost. And now they're one of the lowest performing third grades in the country for large school systems. And I talked to him because his pre-K is very successful. It's a Head Start. And Alvin is a black guy, probably about 70 years old, really, really fascinating, smart man. And he grew up in a segregated Baltimore City. When 1954 hit, Brown v. Board, he was in school. So he lived through it. And he felt as though that he got a really good education in a segregated school system in Baltimore City. He felt, and if you talk to other people of his age, they all say the same thing. Our public schools were good. They were segregated, but they were good. At least that's my experience in Baltimore City talking to people. And I asked him what changed. And that's when he gave me that quote. And he said that he didn't blame it on anything other than he thinks one of the biggest changes that really hurt public education was the advent of the growth of the teachers union. So if a lot of people don't know, the teachers unions really started to gain power and influence in the 70s. That's when they really started to get big. And what Dr. Hathaway was saying was that what happened was teaching went from a profession to a job. And he goes, what I mean by that is that it sort of became an assembly line job where this is when your day starts. This is when you get a break. This is when you take lunch. This is what your pay is going to be. This is what your pay is going to be in 5 years and 10 years. This is when you get days off. This is when you take your afternoon break. This is when you're done with your day. These are the days that you work, 180 or 185 days. We're going to give you a calendar. These are your days. And he's like, he said prior to that, being a teacher was like being a doctor or a lawyer. It was seen as a profession. But when all these guidelines started to get put in by unions, his argument is it became like an assembly line. It became like a job. Kid comes in, kid goes out. Kid comes in, kid goes out. And his argument was that really did a lot of damage to public education in America.
Yeah, and so assuming, and I think you referenced at least some of the teachers and educators that you have experienced in this investigation that are more professional, right? They're committed to the work.
Mm-hmm.
You detail some of them. What was the reaction? What has that reaction been? Because I know that there's been some pretty strong reaction from administration and people who are trying to obscure it, but there are some good actors. And what was that, reaction like?
So I have a whole chapter of the book devoted to what's working. A lot of the book is about grade changing, manipulating data, manipulating crime data, violence data, inflating enrollment, all those things. But there's a lot of shining examples of really good things that are working. So I have a chapter in the book about that. And there are certain schools in Baltimore City and in Maryland that are getting the same per pupil funding, that are pulling kids from the same neighborhoods as every other school, but they're showing great success, and it's really inspiring. And I go to those schools and I tell those stories, and I interview the principals and the teachers and the parents that send kids there and the kids, because I'm trying to get an understanding of what's working. And to really answer your question there, one of the things that really confuses me is that Cecil Elementary, for example, you read about Cecil Elementary and Roxanne Four, the principal there. This was a school that their proficiency rates were 9 or 10 times better than the neighboring elementary schools in Baltimore City. 9 or 10 times better. But yet it doesn't appear that when stories like that are told, that the school system will really take a look at that school and want to replicate it across the entire school system. And that is something that I really don't understand, because, as a journalist, when I was a younger journalist, I would look at people that I admired and I would try to replicate what they're doing. I would look at how they do interviews. I would look at how they write. I would look at how they present. And I would say, this guy is really successful. I want to be like this person. But it doesn't seem like that really happens much in public education. Even when I go to these schools and I put somebody on TV and I say, look what this person is doing, you don't see the larger school system going, yeah, this is great. Let's do this across the entire city. And that's really confusing to me. And it's kind of deflating in a way, because there are examples of great success, but they're not replicated. And I don't know why.
Yeah, well, I mean, I could offer some nuance to that and why, because it's not replicable necessarily, but at the very least, is I think you're alluding to here, is that we would want to look at why and how they're experiencing that success and see what lessons we can learn, right? Maybe it doesn't work exactly in every school because there's different contexts and that kind of thing. But while we're really pointing out, and this investigation really points out some really bad actors, to recognize that most, I think, at least in my opinion, and you can correct you can correct the record for yourselves, is that most teachers are trying to do the right thing and want to do great work, that we're looking at the abuses and problems of a few, and unfortunately some of the few are at the highest levels. One of the pieces that really stood out to me is a sort of alternative high school diploma certification program that really wasn't much of any sort of program of any substance. And as part of that, the man who's responsible for it seems in some ways, eventually, as you talk about it, sort of conflicted in what he's trying to do. And, there's some argument to be made of like, well, even if these, you'll talk about it, I'm sure, the program, but even if these diplomas that these kids were being issued are essentially worthless as far as what they stand for, they at least do give some entry, like it lowers some barriers. So you go to apply for a job and you have, quote unquote, a high school diploma. They don't know if it's good or bad or whatever. So kind of tell the story, that part of the story, if you would.
So that's a school called, it's no longer in operation after we did our stories on it, but it's called New Spiritual Christian Foundation. And what this is Maryland law, and it's a very, very old law, that says if you have a church, you can have a school. And what we have found is that there are some people that have understood that there is a market in Baltimore City for people who were not properly educated in the public school system, probably failed out, don't have a high school diploma, and need one. And if you create a church, which, as you saw in the book, we did, we wanted to test this theory. So we created a church, and then we used that church to create a school that is certified by the Maryland State Department of Education through this state law. I think it's called it's like a church-exempt state law. And we were able to show people that this is really something that can happen. Like these diploma mills can and do happen. We found a school called New Christian Spiritual Foundation that was operating out of a row home in East Baltimore that was not zoned to be a school. It was just a home. And people would pay $200. They do maybe 2 hours of work, and they would get a high school diploma issued to them that would be stamped Maryland State Department of Education. So we had sent in a student to this school that paid their $200, got a workbook, took them about 2 hours, maybe an hour, 15 minutes to do the workbook, went back, handed it in, took a test, took about an hour, 45 minutes. So in 2 hours, they got their high school diploma. And really what this shows is what you just mentioned, that people are looking for that diploma. And in a city like Baltimore, where so many students have been failed, many people feel that that diploma can get them places. But the problem with that is that if you're an employer, a high school diploma is supposed to mean something. It's supposed to mean that you have a certain degree of math and English proficiencies and writing proficiencies, that as soon as you start that job, that there's a base level that employer can expect. And that doesn't really exist much anymore. And it's not just with the church exempt schools like we just talked about, but it also applies to regular public schools. And I mean, I don't know if you plan to get into this, but Maryland in 2020 changed its graduation requirements. And this was not connected to COVID. This was before COVID. Maryland wanted to graduate more kids, but the answer to do that, like we talked about, a couple minutes ago was not to better educate kids. The answer was to change and make it easier to graduate from high school. So the graduating class of 2019 and before that in Maryland, you had to do three things. You had to do 75 service hours, which are like community service hours. You had to pass 21 course credits, and you had to pass 4 assessments in the 4 main subjects: math, English, science, and social studies. Well, in 2020, the state did away with having to pass the assessments. You don't have to pass assessments anymore. All you need to do is have 21 course credits that you pass, which we've already talked about with grade changing, that's everybody, and also 75 service hours. That's all you have to do. So similar to New Spiritual Foundation, many people are arguing now that a high school diploma issued by a traditional public school in the state of Maryland also doesn't come with any reassurances for employers, because you don't have to prove that you're proficient in any of the main subjects. You don't have to be proficient anymore in math or reading in the state of Maryland to graduate from high school. And Drew, it's really why I think that this book is so important, because if anyone's listening to us right now who's outside the state of Maryland, or even a lot of people who are inside the state of Maryland, and they don't realize that, you're thinking you don't have to be proficient in reading to graduate from high school in Maryland. No, you don't. That is where public education is going. It is no longer prioritizing educating kids. It's prioritizing acquisition of funding. And we started out this podcast with me saying that the data and the interviews that I have done led me to that conclusion. And it's things like that. If you really want to help kids graduate, is the way to do that to make it easier to graduate, or is it to challenge them, educate them better so they're more prepared when they leave? Maryland is taking the former route there.
Yeah, well, it seems like there's a perpetual sort of dumbing down of America, and this is an example of it. Maybe one of the last examples we can talk about, and this is something that it struck me as really interesting, because the work that we do in professional development is often funded by federal grants. And one of the schools that you write about got, you'll know better than I think it was, I want to say 1.5 or 50, like a large amount of money, a huge amount of money. And according to your reporting, the Federal Department of Education awarded this without having any substantive conversation with anybody at the school about what they were doing, how they were doing it, or anything, which is just bonkers, mind-blowing, if you want to use the technical terms, right? It's like, what in the world? And so, again, maybe you can sort of tell us more about that story, that part of it.
Sure. So we have an entire chapter in the book devoted to this, and this is from a school called NACA, Northwood Community Academy, and it was a charter school, no longer in existence in Baltimore City after we started reporting on it. And this school applied for a grant, charter school grant through the federal government. And again, we're looking at the data, and a lot of things don't make sense, like the 70% graduation rate, 10% proficiency. How can that happen? Well, this particular school, I think, had an 80% graduation rate with 0 kids proficient in math. And you look at that and you're like, your spidey senses just start going haywire. And then you look at a school that got a $1.5 million federal grant, an expansion grant, even after data like that's coming out of the school. And you're just like, well, how can this happen? So we pulled the survey, the questionnaire, the application, I think is the right word, that the school gave to the federal government to be able to get this grant. And we read through it, and there was a lot of what appeared to be errors, where we could go on the Maryland State Department of Education's website and we could see like the number of suspensions at the school, for example. And then we would compare that to the application to the federal government, and they would be very different numbers. Of course, the one given to the federal government is a much better number. And we went through and we gave many examples like that, where the Maryland State Department of Education's data was different than the data that this school gave to the federal government. And once we started doing those stories, the federal government froze the grant and didn't give any more money to that school. And then that school was shut down by Baltimore City Public Schools. But it really shows, I think, here that public education, There's so much money now, so much money in public education, that I think that when you read the book, you'll come away with the understanding that people want part of that money. There's so much money now. And I think that there's a lot of people that are certainly getting into public education for the right reasons. They want to help kids, specifically kids in underserved areas, poverty, and want to help them. But there's a lot of people now that are getting into public education because it is a means to acquire wealth. And when you're applying for hundreds of millions of dollars of federal grants and you're getting them, and as you said to open this question, the federal government never visited this school before issuing that grant. They never called the operator of the school before issuing that grant. $1.5 million of your dollars, your taxpayer dollars, and the federal government doesn't even bother to knock on the door of the school that they're giving the money to. Or when you have the Calverton Elementary Middle School principal that we talked about earlier, who's making $150,000 a year in a city with 25% poverty rates, $150,000 a year, and she's changing failing grades to passing to move kids along. You know, people want the money, and it's really what public education in many ways has become, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah, and I would imagine that in Baltimore, you've gotten quite a reaction to this. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what that reaction is locally, and anything or not internationally. I mean, internationally, if you have anything to share, but nationally, and especially because you don't get into any of this in your book, and I'm wondering if there's anything to say about it in terms of sort of politics and partisanship and actors coming from one side or the other.
Yeah, well, I intentionally did not want this book to be a political book, because I didn't want to. I don't really mention Republicans or Democrats or conservatives or liberals. I didn't want to do that because I felt that turns people off. And I want people to look at the data and hear the stories from the parents and the teachers and the administrators, and hear the stories of outright corruption without that lens attached. So I really hope that when people do read Failure Factory, they don't read it from the perspective of, Democrat or Republican, because that's not how it's written. I'm a journalist. I'm an investigative journalist. Like, we pride ourselves on hard-hitting investigative journalism that is truthful, but also, fair. So I don't get into any of that. Within the city, I can say that our reporting is largely ignored by the people who lead the city. However, the residents of the city really strongly support Project Baltimore and what we're doing. And I think you can figure out why, because the people at the top are making a lot of money, and the people at the bottom, and there's a lot of them in Baltimore, are the victims of what's really happening. Now, last March, President Trump at the White House signed an executive order to dismantle the Department of Education. And when he gave his speech at the White House, he mentioned one school system. He mentioned Baltimore, and he mentioned our reporting. He doesn't mention me by name, but he mentioned our reporting. And he said that 40% of the high schools in Baltimore City, and this is 2023 that we reported this, 40% of the high schools had 0 students test proficient in math. And that story is in the book, and I talk about how we go about getting the data, and that we broke that in 2023. And Drew, when I say a story went viral, I mean, that's about as viral of a story as you can get. when you have nearly half of the high schools in a major U.S. city cannot produce one kid proficient in math, and then the president talks about it. That's a big deal. Well, in Baltimore City, there's crickets. They don't say anything. And I think that largely the case that I make in the book is that's why the school system isn't improving, because the elected officials and the public officials in Baltimore are not demanding that it improve. They don't hold the school system accountable. When you have 10% of your kids that are proficient in math, with $1.7 billion going into that school system, and the public officials don't have anything negative to say about that, that's a problem. And why would the school system improve if there's nobody within the city who has a position of power who is telling it to improve? If somebody were giving you $150,000 a year and you didn't have any kids proficient in math in your school, but they're going to give you $150,000 again next year. What is your motivation to improve? Now, there are some people that are self-motivated and they'll do it anyway, but I think most people aren't. And if someone's going to give them money and not expect a certain degree of return on that money, most of the time you're not going to get a positive return. And that's what we're seeing in Baltimore.
Yeah. Well, the book is named Failure Factory: How Baltimore City Public Schools Deprive Taxpayers and Students of a Future. Where should they find you? Where should they find the book? Anything that you didn't get a chance to say that we haven't talked about?
Sure. So the book can be purchased anywhere books are sold. Local bookstores, if they don't have it, they can certainly order it. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Goodreads, it's all there. As of yesterday, I looked, the book was still a bestseller on Amazon. It's doing really well. And I think it's because it's eye-opening. And I think in 2020, during COVID, people really got to see what was happening in public schools when the public schools came home. And I kind of see this book, Drew, as the next step of that, where now you're really getting a granular look at how data is manipulated, how the money is spent, all of that stuff. And I do feel that it's correctable. I feel that public schools can significantly improve. I know we're out of time now, but in the book, I go over solutions and what those could be and what they would look like that wouldn't be expensive or cost any money at all. And 90% of the kids in this country go to public school, which means 90% of future voters and 90% of future taxpayers are currently in public schools. And we cannot abandon our public schools. We have to try to enforce them. We have to try to improve them. Even if it's best for your family to homeschool or go to private school, don't forget about your local public school. Your local economy, your housing is all attached to the quality of the public school system. We got to continue to fight to try to improve them.
Yeah, and as an advocate for education and public education, I'm also a school choice advocate and that kind of thing. I do think it's really important to take a critical look at what's happening in our schools, even the ones that are doing well. But certainly when you have examples like this, the book's really interesting. It's not a hard read. So if anybody is thinking, man, this seems like a lot to take in, it's a couple hundred pages, certainly worth taking a look at if you're interested in any of this kind of thing. And fun fact, we do professional development. We work with the Baltimore Public School, which is now closed. And you think, so what was that money? How was that used, and how well was that used? And certainly something that can be frustrating from our point of view. But again, that's a whole other podcast. Chris, thanks for the conversation. Thanks for the book and the investigation.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on. And if your listeners do pick up a copy of the book, I'm very easy to get in touch with. Chris Papst on X, Chris Papst on Facebook. You just Google my name, and I'm very easy to get in touch with. Please write me an email. Let's continue the conversation.
Yep, and we'll put those links in the show notes. So thanks again.
Thank you.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.